Thank you very much. So, hello everybody. My name is René and I'm from Fraunhofer in Germany. And today I'd like to talk to you about the way that we build, share and document our evaluation datasets in firmware vulnerability research. Because if you've ever done that before, creating such a large firmware corpus, you might agree with me that it is not that easy to create a really good, scientifically sound one, right? But what does that actually mean, scientifically sound? Well, for us, it means that the results that we can draw from these data sets should be transparent, comprehensible, and verifiable for everybody that tries and wants to replicate our data sets. And of course, we in science, they should be also representative, right? The paper that we wrote is exactly about that. How can we help researchers to create better, more scientifically sound corpora in the future? So we have 4 major contributions in this analysis paper. First of all, we analyze the challenges. So what are the practical challenges of good corpus creation in reality? Then we propose a set of guidelines that if you want to and it fits your use case, you can use as some kind of checklist to create a more scientific sound corpus in the future. We also use these guidelines to perform a literature analysis over 45 papers to observe what is currently going on in research and corpus creation. And we finally use these guidelines to create and to release a reference corpus called LFWC that if it fits your needs, you can also get. But let's start at the beginning. Why is it actually hard to create a good corpus? That is best explained by an example. So suppose we have a cool new prototype, maybe taint analysis, that helps us to find real bugs in ARM-based firmware. And the goal of this paper for the evaluation is now to create a sizable firmware corpus that gives robust statistical results, right? Maybe 1,000 samples. As I said, that's not that easy. So for us and you to better navigate the problem space, we created a catalog of 8 challenges. Some of them are general, they fit to every paper, and some of them are dependent on the methods that we actually want to evaluate. For this talk, I'd like to focus on this one, challenge number 2, because it is a major showstopper, right? That is the firmware unpacking. If you don't know and are not familiar with this kind of stuff, firmware usually comes in binary, partially unknown, partially encrypted formats. So in order to actually evaluate our prototype for ARM-based firmware, we have to establish compatibility, which in turn means we must reverse engineer and put a lot of manual effort into getting at the very contents of this firmware. And then if we've done that, that doesn't mean automatically that it is suitable for our evaluation. Because we are focusing, for example, on ARM-based firmware, and only after we've reversed the firmware image, we can evaluate the data relevance, right? Because if we do not find ARM-based code in there, why should we use it inside of our prototype evaluation? And even then, if we've been able to do that, we have invested a lot of manual time, but cannot share it with our research peers, because the firmware has copyrighted material inside of there, and we would incriminate ourselves if we would just, I don't know, upload it to RapidShare or something like that, right? So what you usually see in research is that we try to preserve data replicability by trying to document everything that is relevant to replicate this corpus, right? But as you can imagine, this approach is rather error-prone and different across papers. So how can we get out of this kind of Wild West situation? In this paper, we come to contribution 2 now. We propose a set of guidelines in a 3-layer model that might help you to create more robust corpora in the future for your next paper. So let's start with the first layer. We defined some pretty abstract goals. Of course, there's replicability and representativeness, but there's also method orientation, which is referring to the challenges that we just talked about, right? There is no one-size-fits-all corpus. We always have to adjust our corpus composition based on what we actually want to evaluate. But that is rather abstract. So how can we implement this inside of a data set? Well, with data requirements, right? So we propose a set of 6 requirements. These are pretty intuitive and well known. I mean, ground truth, clean data, that is no big deal. But the question is, how can we implement this in the actual firmware corpus? So we thought about 16 different measures that feed into the fulfillment of these data requirements. This is not a complete list here, so you might come with new ideas. But to give you a quick rundown and a little bit of insight, let me give you an example here. So a good mix of device properties, like maybe the manufacturer and the model, definitely contributes to the heterogeneity and diversity of our data set, right? And this, in turn, will probably increase the representativeness of our results. And if we use this information and annotate it in our artifacts as rich metadata on a sample basis, which is legal to share with our peers, it could also contribute to replicability, because then others can go out there with the information and the corpus composition and get the binary data from legal sources, right? So there are 11 more of these measures here, but maybe we take these measures now and take a look at what is going on in actual research. How do we actually create our corpora in research? And what we did is we basically collected 44 papers from the typical A* conferences, published between 2013 and 2023, and the only selection criterion was that these papers either created and or used a firmware corpus for vulnerability research. I read all of them. I analyzed the artifacts and collected data regarding the fulfillment of our requirements, in the sense that we took a look at whether or not they documented certain aspects and provided certain metadata or not. So these are the results. As you can imagine, that was not so much fun to collect, and I bet it's also not so much fun to look at. But if we take this data and cluster it by documentation, right? What you see here is by measure and documentation. We ask ourselves how many papers documented a specific type of measure, like the packed samples and unpacked samples. We can get some pretty interesting details regarding what is going on in research. So the more blue you see here, the better, because that means, well, they documented it. Partially documented would be something like an incomplete list of modals. So there's some kind of nebulous aspect inside of the corpus composition that we do not know about, and thus cannot replicate. Again, there's a lot to talk about here right now, but maybe for this presentation we focus on the key takeaway, and that is that missing metadata and documentation threatens the soundness of our own work. As you can see here, around 70% of papers documented the acquisition steps, which is a pretty good thing. But what you also see is that there is very few and or incomplete metadata regarding certain aspects that would definitely help us in this scenario of replicating the corpus to actually do that. And if you recall the showstopper, that is the firmware unpacking, we found that only 30% of papers fully documented the unpacking process, which in turn means you have to jump through all the hoops of unpacking this firmware yourself if they didn't document it correctly. At this point, this is a huge threat to replicability. It's basically gone. The result verifiability thus becomes also very hard in these papers, and the representativeness is also hard to assess because we cannot get the data sets that easily, right? So maybe we can do a little bit better in the future. Surprise, contribution number 4. We propose a reference corpus called Linux Firmware Corpus, LFWC, and we curated a set of 10,900 fully unpacked verified Linux samples with verified Linux kernel inside across many, many devices, classes, manufacturers, and a rather large version history. But the most important stuff here is on the right. Because we wanted to check every box inside of our own guidelines, we collected a ton of metadata regarding each sample, which are, as I said, legal to share, right? So download links, we have archive.org fallbacks, we have file identity hashes, and we also have information regarding what is inside of these samples. So, for example, the Linux kernel and the architecture. We pull this data out and then annotate it to the samples. In our paper, we took around 5 pages just to document this process of creating the corpus, because we thought it would be nice to have very deep insights inside of the corpus composition. And for this replicable unpacking, which is a huge showstopper, as I said, and also these metadata that we pull out regarding the Linux kernel and the instruction set architecture, we use the so-called firmware analysis and comparison tool called FACT, which automates this process based on various unpacking heuristics and signatures. And maybe I might disclose now, we are also the developers of this tool. We open sourced this tool over 10 years ago, and you are able to replicate this whole process using this tool. Speaking of replicability, it works like this. If you want to replicate this corpus, we give you the metadata, and based on your own criteria, for example, only give me ARM-based routers, you can filter this dataset and pass it to a download script that we also give you in the artifacts. And this download script will try to download everything, right? And the neat thing is, it will also tell you what's missing. So you can go out there and use, for example, the file hashes to search on VirusTotal for the samples. Everything is then passed to FACT, which automatically unpacks, analyzes, and deduplicates this corpus so that you are left with a fully unpacked, replicable corpus ready for your next evaluation. So 1 year after creation, we did a replicability study about this. Turns out it is pretty high. We were able to obtain, without the analysis part, roughly 99.7% of all samples within this corpus, without anything else but the metadata and the download script. Of course, this number is going to drop as links go dead inside of the internet. That's how it works. But this is an integral part of my PhD thesis, so I'm committing to further updates at least once a year. OK, let's summarize. We basically just wanted to help researchers to build better corpora in the future, more sound corpora. So we had these 4 contributions of a corpus creation challenge catalog. Then we propose a set of guidelines that you might use for your next evaluation. We took a look at what is going on in current research and found that more documentation and more metadata would definitely help to create more replicable and thus sound corpora. And we created and released a reference corpus called LFWC to prove feasibility of this process and show that there's replicability. Thank you very much. Here you can get the artifacts, and we also kindly invite you to contribute to this corpus. Thank you.
Okay, if you have questions, please just come to the microphone. Well, maybe I can start one. So during your task, what do you think is the most challenging part while you're collecting all the papers?
So it was not always, we have a lot more insights about what is going on inside in these papers, so we kindly invite you to read it. One thing that was hard is to actually get the real numbers, like packed versus unpacked samples, because a lot of papers advertise in the abstract with a pretty high corpus sample count, right? But it turns out when you go into the evaluation that where the corpus size maybe drops by 40%. So this ambiguity regarding the actual real numbers was pretty hard to get. Mm-hmm.
Okay. We're probably going to have time for one more question. Anybody? All right, so thank you again. Let's give another round of applause for the speaker.
Thank you.